but it's what's coming in on the back of that. Amendments to the Human Rights Act, amendments to the Criminal Code that really cause a lot of concern.
And that mandate will bring this country into new territories that no other nation has entered.
When the drawing of the Holy Spirit empowers us to use our liberty of conscience to choose Christ, we experience true freedom.
If ever there was a time to be reevaluating what the Constitution is, what it protects and what it provides for, it would be now.
If God didn't call up someone just like him, we would not have America today. We certainly would not have the freedoms that we have today.
We are living today in an era of misinformation, cancel culture, coercion of conscience, and intolerance for those who deviate from the established orthodoxy.
Well, folks, you know, when I see this in a little while, I'm going home. First of all, it tells me a couple of things. One is I understand my role right now is to hurry up so you can go home. But then the other one is when I was in academy, this was the song we would sing when we were getting ready to go home. You know, for Christmas and all of that kind of thing. And so it was always a sense of like, let's hurry up and get going. Okay, great, thank you. Well, it's great to be here with you. I told Conrad yesterday morning that I wasn't so sure that I was going to be able to make it because I looked at the forecast and we were going to have some snow in the Toronto region, and guess what? We had snow in the Toronto region. But anyhow, I decided, my wife and I said, you know, maybe you ought to, you know, put that extra effort in. I was very happy when I finally got across on the state side because I crossed over in Sarnia, the Blue Water Bridge, and after about 15 minutes or so, the roads were clear and it was like smooth sailing all the way around. It was around 0 degrees when I left home. It was like minus 10 Celsius. Honestly, I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but anyhow, it was cold. But in the morning when we woke up, it was minus 17. And so we've been having some kind of cold weather, then it get warm and all the rest. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about what's been happening in Canada. And honestly, I've got so much information here, it would be kind of like having a fire hose. And so I'm going to try to limit it to just this idea, the idea of a legal revolution against religious accommodation, against the accommodation of religion in Canada. And I'll first just tell you a little bit about myself. I'll look at a little bit about Canada and the kind of situation we find ourselves in the current moment. Which is indeed a nation in distress in many ways. And part of that distress, you should not be surprised, is living a little close to the world's superpower, who is anxious to, how will we say, wrap its arms around the country. Then I want to look at a little bit about how rights work in Canada. I want to primarily look at the emphasis on religion and how things are being challenged there, some of the current challenges, and then a little bit about how do we face the future. First of all, this is a picture of a boat, a schooner. It's known as the SS Southern Cross. And it is very important in my family history, just because of the fact that my great-grandfather, right here, was on this schooner, and it was a schooner that went out in March, usually in the early part of the spring. They go for seals, and in 1914, it was lost at sea. And about 176 men were lost. And what is particularly troublesome for anyone involved in this kind of an experience is that the captain was told to go and shelter in the port of St. Mary's. And he decided that no, he wasn't going to do that. Instead, what he was going to do is he's going to try and run for St. John's. And I'll just show you. St. John's would be right over here. And the boat was on this part of the island, making its way around. And a major storm came up, and he was supposed to either go up in here or up in here for just to wait out the storm. But he didn't do that because at the time, all of the various ships that were out, the SS Newfoundland and the Stefano and so on, whoever got in first got the highest price for the pelts. And so he was anxious to get into St. John's first. And as you make your way along here, this is known as Cape Pine and Cape Race. Out here is just between here and Europe, it's just the Atlantic Ocean. By then you're into the very fierce waves. And if you ever come and visit God's country, by the way, in Newfoundland, you will find that we can have spectacular waves from time to time. And so it was that as they were making their way around the peninsula there, the Avalon Peninsula, the ship was never seen again. The lighthouse that was right here saw it, and another ship passed by it, coming the opposite direction. No one knows whatever happened to it. Anyhow, the moral of the story is this, and this had a profound impact on my life simply because my grandfather, the son of Joseph, was only 4 months old. And my grandfather was the only child. So the moral of the story is that when a storm blows, we need to take cover. And right now there is a storm brewing, not only in this country, but I think, frankly, right around the world, with respect to all kinds of trouble when it comes to our religious freedom. So some of the things I want to talk about right now is to talk about the idea that Canada is in stress, but nothing new. From what I can see on the news, that the United States seems to be in a bit of stress right now. One of our prime ministers, whose son was prime minister a little while ago, so Prime Minister Trudeau, the first, had stated at one point to a group of American leaders down in Washington, D.C., that living next to the United States for Canada is much like an elephant in bed with a mouse, or a mouse in bed with an elephant. Every time there's a twitch of the elephant, the mouse gets scared. Well, that's kind of how it is. So when you look at Canada, and you look at where Greenland is, and there's talks of taking over Greenland, there happens to be another country really close that is also being talked about right now as well, as our pastor talked about it this morning. But within Canada itself, there is this sense of what happens now. Remember, Canada became a country. I don't know, many people don't realize it, but we became a country simply because we didn't want to be Americans. Sorry, no offense. But when you folks decided that you were going to go against the British Crown, our ancestors decided, no, we're not having this, we're checking out. And so they crossed Lake Ontario, they crossed the St. Lawrence, they went over into Nova Scotia. And there's certain, that group the refugees from the American Revolution were known as loyalists in Canada, obviously for good reason. They were loyal to the crown. And so there's always been this sense of, what should we be doing? And we should be, at one time we had the entire world empire protecting the loyalists. That empire is nothing but a rout of a country right now, I'm afraid. No offense to my UK friends. But the United Kingdom is not what it once was. And so there is no, we have great pomp and ceremony when we have the king come over recently and read the speech from the throne and all the rest. And I look at it and I say, really? I mean, it's like, it's all performative, right? It is no power there whatsoever. And so anyhow, I point all this out to say that Canada became a country because we were all a bunch of independent, known as the British North America, where we were individual colonies. And as I pointed out, that God's colony was right here, Newfoundland, where even Newfoundland decided not to join Canada until 1949. And even then, that was, and many people in Newfoundland felt that they were pushed to join Canada, because the fear was that Newfoundland would actually become part of the United States, because if you remember, Roosevelt and Churchill had a very good relationship in World War II, and on the island of Newfoundland there were like 5 U.S. military bases. And as my grandfather would often tell me, that was the place where you went for work, because the Americans came in, they built roads, they put in international airports. Gander International Airport is a product paid by your taxes, or at least your taxes of your forebears. But all of the thing was that in 1867 we became a country, minus Newfoundland, because Newfoundland decided it didn't want to join. But we became a country in 1867. Does anyone have any idea as to why? Because the North won the Civil War. That's the reason Canada exists. Because William Seward, who was the Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln, said, hey, listen, we should start a war with Britain so we can go up and take over British North America. And Lincoln's famous words to his Secretary of War, we will fight one war at a time. Now, that wasn't too much comfort for the British North Americans, because they felt, well, soon as that war is over, then this is going to be the new war. But something happened. Your president was assassinated. And really, you talk about how things happen in history. In my reading of things, I wouldn't be surprised that we would have already been Americans if it had not been for the assassination of Lincoln and the struggle of trying to settle the South after the war. But that is why Canada became a country. And so now, the country looks at all of that, and we're seeing now that Canadians are looking at the United States from a very different lens. Remember, I don't know if you remember this or not, but we remember it because we were taught it in school. But in 1812, there was a ship off the coast of eastern United States that got boarded by the British, because America was trading with the arch enemy of Britain, which happened to be Napoleon. And one of the ships on its way to France was taken over by the British. And that was reason enough for Thomas Jefferson to declare war against Britain in 1812. And for a 2-year war. So what happened was the Americans came over to Toronto and they burned the place to the ground. And then the British decided they were going to return the favor, went up to Chesapeake Bay and burned the White House. Well, it wasn't White House then, but it became a White House because it had to be painted, and they decided to paint it white after the burning. So you can thank Canada for your White House. Okay, so there's a lot of history here, and there's a lot of struggle even further on into the later part of the 1800s. The Irish were particularly upset with the British control of Canada, and they would raid the country and so on. So there's been a lot of history. So, but here's the thing. Why is Canada in stress? Canada is in stress because of the situation with the United States. Canada is also in stress because the provinces are not getting along. Even in the midst of this idea that the United States may take over Canada, there is still tons of fighting going on within the provinces. Alberta, which is the Texas of the North, got tons of oil, and it wants to run a pipeline out here. British Columbia says, no way are we going to allow a pipeline to go out to the Pacific Ocean. And Alberta says, fine, then what we'll do is we'll come down here and we'll make a deal with Washington and Wyoming, and we'll see about getting a pipeline that way if we have to. We've got Quebec, which is talking about succession again. Going to be new elections in a few weeks or a few months in Quebec, and it looks like the succession party is probably going to win election again, so we're going to have a referendum in Quebec. We're already going to have a guaranteed referendum in Alberta to separate. Newfoundland has always been an outs with Quebec and all the rest of it. Ontario is trying to get things to hold things on together because it has the automotive industry. Everything is in flux in Canada. And then on top of that, you've got religious issues going on. I just point out here some of the things of what's happening. By the way, when you go to the Canadian border now, to the U.S. border from the Canadian side, I mean, I was nobody. There was no one ahead of me. I go up to the border, and the guy asked me, so what are you doing? I said, well, I'm going to be speaking about religious freedom in Canada tomorrow at a church. And then for the next 15 minutes, he and I had a great conversation about religion. And I'm like, there is no way I would have that conversation going the other way tomorrow. You know what I mean? Canada will, like the Canadian border guards would not be interested in religion or anything else. You know, it's interesting, there's a famous saying that says, the past is like a strange country. They do things differently there. There is no question that the differences between Canada and the U.S. is different because you folks do things differently, let me tell you. But anyhow, we're seeing a lot less people coming in. As I pointed out, some of these things that brought Canada about. Well, so when the Loyalists came to Canada, the country, the various provinces, they were known as colonies at the time, had, in essence, established churches. Now, you folks have had an experience of established churches, but nevertheless, there was the idea that churches and state were really not separate. If you know anything about the Church of England, of which I was raised a member of the Church of England, the idea of, you know, at least when I was a kid and I come into church and I'd see all these flags of St. George and so on, and church was part of the experience of who you were, not only religiously, but politically. And so there was a great understanding within Canada that it was a Christian nation. It was a Christian nation with a difference in the sense that it had Catholic Quebec, it had Protestant Ontario. Names were different then, but I won't go into that right now. But the thing is that you had the French and the English, the Protestant and the Catholic, and we begrudgingly got along because we had a common enemy, right? It was the United States is going to take us over, so we better work together. However, there was a lot of strife within the Catholic and English colonies in their history, even in the province of Newfoundland, where I'm from. There were lots of times when the British admirals would come over, and for a long time, the British wouldn't even allow people to live permanently on the island of Newfoundland because They didn't want the people, an indigenous population on the island, because they would compete with the fishermen from Britain that would be coming over and all of that kind of stuff. And then absolutely no Catholics. And any Catholic that put up a house in Newfoundland was simply roped and then pulled into the ocean. And it literally, in the 1870s in Newfoundland, there was all kinds, it was really what you would think of Northern Ireland. There was all kinds of gun battles that went on in St. John's. The most famous one happened in the 1870s, where the Catholic Prime Minister was dismissed by the Protestant Governor General. And that created all kinds of rioting, and the Brits had garrisons there. They opened fire on the crowd, and there were all kinds of people that died as a result of that. So there was lots of fighting going on over religion. And then it seemed like things kind of calmed down, but then in the 1940s, we had some religious revolt against the whole idea of serving in the military. Jehovah's Witnesses were among them. But Jehovah's Witnesses also did something else. They would go into Quebec, and there they would be saying how horrible Catholics are, and call them Antichrist, and call them this, and call them that. And eventually what happened was that the Premier of Quebec decided that he was going to get at the Jehovah's Witnesses, and basically you had to have a license if you were going to go door to door. They, of course, would never get it, so they would still go door to door anyhow, and then they would be put in jail, they would lose their businesses, all of that. And famous cases went up to the Supreme Court of Canada. One in 1953 was a case involving Jehovah's Witnesses, wherein Justice Ivan Rand, who said that a religious incident reverberates from one end of this country to the other, and there is nothing to which the body politic of the Dominion is more sensitive. Religious turmoil in Canada is also something that is, you would recognize here in the United States, religious turmoil. It's a national event, as it were, because these kinds of things just create so much tension and so much emotion. As time goes on after World War II, we've got a lot more secularism coming in. We get changing demographics. The recent consensus or census right now is that we're about 60% Christian now in Canada. It used to be like literally like 90-some% or whatever, but now we're getting a huge influx of immigration. That is creating tremendous amounts of stress. You just look on any website in Canada right now, and there's all kinds of discussion on those issues. The media has become extremely secular. The public institutions at large are secular. So the media, which is being paid for now by the government because people are no longer paying for the traditional media with newspapers and all the rest of it. And so what's happening is that the government is paying approved news outlets huge amounts of money. CBC, which is the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, is the largest recipient. It's currently at I think it's $1.4 billion right now, Canadian. Now that doesn't mean nothing. That's $20 US. You know, you get the idea. But it's, but nevertheless, for us, it's big money. And the current Prime Minister has promised to double the amount that they're going to get. Well, what's happening is that the CBC is, in essence, a propaganda arm of the government. Because it is not going to say anything that's going to be in any way against the government. It just won't. And a recent, recent as in within the last 6 months, one journalist did have the audacity to go against the government and was asking one of the cabinet ministers some very hard questions, and he is no longer at CBC. So, and it's not only CBC, but it's the other so-called independent news sources such as CTV News and others that are global, another one. They get huge amounts of money, and I mean it's like into the hundreds of thousands and sometimes millions. So it's It's really quite the game going on. There is what I refer to in my book, and I will talk about this in a little bit, but in here I call it the cathedral. This kind of like we have this accepted narrative of how you are to believe how things are. And when that's reinforced by your universities, by your government, by your media, by all the institutions, then it seems like, okay, well, that's the only way. I mean, that is then the truth of things. So anyhow, we're in stress. There's no question about it. We've got a rise of the administrative state. I'll talk about that a little bit. Okay. Want to talk real quick about our Constitution. You folks have it so easy. You've got one document that is your Constitution. We only have about 24 documents that are our Constitution, but we even make it even more complicated because we also say that there are unwritten constitutional principles that we must know. Because you see, we part of the British experience where in Britain they still don't have a written constitution, it's an unwritten constitution. For example, there is absolutely nothing in any of the 24 documents that says anything about the office of Prime Minister. You have a whole section about your president and a whole section about your judiciary and your legislature and all the rest of it. There is nothing about the Prime Minister, and yet the Prime Minister wields it is the most powerful office in the country. And it boggles my mind, and it boggles, how it's kind of like, it's by tradition. And so then, if a Prime Minister does something outside of the tradition, well, then he creates a tradition for the next guy. It's quite interesting. Anyhow, so the two major acts that most people think about is the Constitution Act. It used to be called the British North America Act of 1867. That's when we got so frightened together that we decided to have a country. And then in 1982, that is when we got the Charter of Rights. Prior to that, we had to lean upon the judges to ensure that our rights were being protected. Justice Ivan Rand is one of those heroes in my view. But one of the problems I have is that a lot of people that go to university or go and attend law school, they think the world began in 1982. No, it didn't. We have a whole history of law, but this is the mindset today. And anyhow, I got to go through here. So, of course, when we think of the rule of law, we think of separation of powers of the various the three areas of government, the judiciary, legislative, executive, that the laws apply equally, including those who govern. This concept right here was challenged just yesterday. The Federal Court of Appeal gave its decision as to whether or not it was right for Justin Trudeau to have invoked the Emergencies Act during the 2022 convoy. Do you folks remember that one at all? Well, the court said that it was unconstitutional. It supported a lower court that had said that. But I was just so pleased with the Federal Court of Appeal that it made that decision. And it said that even the government is responsible to uphold the Constitution. Can you imagine that would be something that would be litigated over? And I just found it so amazing. Anyhow, I wrote this book about the convoy and all of its, all that had happened. I'll explain how that came about. But I am so pleased to report that the Federal Court of Appeal said, it didn't say anything about my book, but my arguments were the very same arguments, similar at least, that the court said yesterday. And so this book is still in vogue as far as I'm concerned. And so it's just common sense would tell you that you can't go reinventing the Constitution because of your own political ideology. Anyhow, so rules should be fixed and announced beforehand. That's what we would consider the rule of law, right? Separation of powers and so on. So the Charter is a document, like I said, in 1982. It deals with the personal relationship between the individual and the state. That got totally thrown out with respect to the COVID-19 experience. But anyhow, government is responsible not to offend the charter. It offended it in spades during COVID, as far as the courts haven't said that about COVID, but they said it about the Invocations Act, and I'm very thankful even they did that. Okay, here's the kicker. So the beginning of the charter says, whereas Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law, the courts have said that the supremacy of God clause is meaningless. Isn't that nice? It's only part of the Constitution, but it's meaningless. But the rule of law clause is still very important. In fact, when it was, this was part of the negotiations that went on in bringing the charter into effect. This was a lot of the Western provinces were wanting to have the supremacy of God in there. What was interesting was that Prime Minister Trudeau at the time, that would be the father of Justin, said, I don't think God really cares if he's in the Constitution or not. But anyhow, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So in other words, you have your rights, but there are limits. We all recognize that there are limits to be limits, but who makes that decision? The courts do, of course. Okay, and the very next section is everyone has the following fundamental freedoms. Freedom of well, it looks like I don't know how that happened, but anyhow, freedom of conscience and religion. Trudeau wanted to have freedom of conscience. He felt that was broader than freedom of religion. Okay, that's where the struggle is. The struggle is between what the judges say as a reasonable limit. And let me tell you, the reasonable limit when the charter came into effect in 1982 is very different than the reasonable limit of 2026. And that kind of, there's a really great decision made by Chief Justice Brian Dixon in 1985 dealing with the Big M drug case. That dealt with the Lord's Day Act, right? There was the Sunday legislation that forced everyone to be closed on Sunday. And ultimately the court ruled that it was unconstitutional. You have the right to entertain your religious beliefs, to declare it openly, to manifest it, and so on. It's really a great decision. I don't have time to dig into that. But I just want you to know that it was a very powerful decision for religious freedom. The other area, so remember, the charter is between the individual and the government, acts as the buffer, and human rights legislation is the horizontal relationship, is between individual citizens, right? So you can't discriminate when you're renting a house and all the rest of it for all kinds of reasons, except there is an exception for religious communities. If you've got a organization that is specific for a particular religious community, you can discriminate as to who can live there, who can work there, all of that kind of thing. Okay, same thing with marriage. You're allowed to have a provision in there with respect to ensuring that no clergy or religious body who refuses to solemnize a marriage that's going to be against their faith, you can go ahead and do that. Okay, this was done as a result of the 2004 decision of the Supreme Court dealing with marriage. It had to do with the same-sex marriage. And the court said that, yeah, it's okay for you to redefine marriage, but you've got to protect the religious communities. I honestly, right now, if that decision was now at the Supreme Court, I'd be very surprised, based on how the courts have gone, as I'll share, that the court would hold the same opinion today if it were challenged. Okay. Another thing is that we also had, because of marriage, a lot of people were concerned that, okay, if as a religious community you do not recognize the marriages that the government recognizes, then you're going to take away our tax exemption. And the Income Tax Act was amended so that, no, it wouldn't. That almost got challenged just the other little while ago. I'll explain about that. So all kinds. We got property tax exemptions for churches, regular school activities for religious observance, entertainment tax, all of these kinds of things are exempt. Okay, folks, Let me tell you, it looks on paper like the church and religion is really amazing. Things is such a very Gentile country when it comes to freedom of religion, until you start looking at some things. Okay, some of the challenges. Marriage commissioners. The courts have now decided that if you are not a member of the clergy and you have a particular view with respect to marriage, sorry, but as an agent of the state, you're going to have to marry whoever the state says can be married. Yeah, so that because you're an agent. But remember, a clergy is an agent of the state when they marry as well. So the logic is at odds here. Government actors, the TWU law school case was involved in a law school which it was a Christian university, wanted to have a law school, but they required students to sign a community covenant that amongst various aspects of how they ought to live their lives while they're students, because it was an evangelical Christian university, no smoking, no, no sexual immorality and all that kind of stuff. And it was that issue, the issue of marriage and so on, that the BC Law Society ruled and said, we're not going to even allow these guys, if they graduate from the school, to write the exam because of this crazy thing. Can you imagine having members on the bench who are graduates of TWU? They would be prejudiced, even on the bench, kind of arguments that were being made. We had a challenge with the registered charitable status. This has been something that was pounded during the TWU case when I was up there. I was legal counsel for an intervener in the case, and my seatmate actually, who was the lawyer for the Canadian Bar Association, she got up and she was making the argument that when the government is handing out a license to entities in Canada, that you must ensure that those entities are in essence in line with charter values. Now, charter values is another one of those unwritten constitutional principles that never came into existence until the charter came around. And basically, it's the idea that a judge says, well, even though it's not in the Constitution, it goes against the spirit of the Constitution. And that is the value that lies behind the Constitution, and therefore it's unconstitutional. Make sense? Anyhow, so that was part of the argument in the TWU, and we made all kinds of... so she was making the argument that it violates the charter values. And at that point, I knew full well that the issue of charitable registration for advancement of religion was going to be an issue, and sure enough, it was. Back in December of 24, at the very end of the Trudeau government, the Finance Committee recommended to the government to take away the charitable status of advancement of religion. Now, what that would have meant, had the government done that under Mark Carney, who's the new Prime Minister, would have been that the churches and so on, or any other para-organization that was dealing with the advancement of religion, that would be taken away. Okay, so you wouldn't get a charitable credit for giving donations to that organization. Another one, property tax status. We are getting more and more entities now, local communities who are trying to say, well, it's okay if you have the sanctuary as being tax exempt, but the fellowship hall that you've got over there, why, that's not a sanctuary, so then that should be taxed where this isn't. And by the way, if you're using this sanctuary as part of your daycare program, why, that's not tax exempt either. And so we got a nibbling going on with respect to property tax status, Canada Summer Jobs case. Are you guys bored yet? Not bored, okay. All right, so the Canada Summer Jobs situation I was involved with in a big way in 2018. The government has a program Like, we're such a great socialist country that we love to hand out money because we're so rich. And so what we do is we give the money to various charities to ensure that students, when they're off from university, will have a job in the summer so they can gain experience. But they decided that on the application form that you had to agree to that you were in favor of abortion, you were in favor of same-sex marriage, you were in favor of X, Y, Z. In other words, the total ideology of the government. And so we said, no, this is totally unacceptable. Why should it be on the basis of our religious commitment as a religious institution, which is already a charitable institution? Why should it... what did I do here now? I decided to just really go for it. Okay, so then what ends up happening is that the government says, okay, after we had all kinds of fuss and all the rest, it was quite a wild time, let me tell you. But anyhow, the government finally decided not to have that test on the application form. Great, right? No. Because what happens now is when you apply for the money, the government bureaucrats are investigating your institution, all your websites, all your filings, all your CRA documents and everything else to see whether or not you are ideologically in line with the government. And if you're not going to get the money for this hiring of students. So for example, summer camps and those kinds of things, you're not going to get the money, but all of the other groups will. And anyhow, so that's another example. I told you about CBC. CBC is constantly running stories about the discrimination that goes on in churches. They hire only ministers who are affiliated with that church. They only allow Sunday school teachers who are affiliated with that church. They won't allow other people, and yet the government is sponsoring the churches because of the charity tax credit that is given. During COVID-19, we had a situation where people were told that it wasn't I gotta watch what I'm doing here. Let me see. Wow, I went by that real fast, didn't I? Let me just see. Anyhow, so the whole thing was that you couldn't have a religious objection. We've talked about this, of course, and in this community here, you know the issue quite well. But isn't it interesting how everyone around the world had the exact same wording? I was in South Africa a while back, and they had the exact same wording. And the idea was that if your religious community that you're a member of, that you say that it's against my religious faith to have that vaccine, but your community says it's okay, then I'm sorry, but there's no religious exemption for you, and so forth. Anyhow, the COVID-19 thing gave a impetus for the trucker convoy. You folks actually had it very easy in this country during COVID. You guys think it was really rough, but let me tell you what rough was like. Rough was like being confined in your house for months and months and months at a time, and neighbors would be calling. Now maybe that happened down here too, I don't know, but they would be calling to let the authorities know that you went out and you somehow violated the COVID policy. You couldn't even have a church service even if you held it out in the parking lot, and no one was was even breathing air against each other. It was just simply the church would have a small FM radio station where it was broadcasting its message to the people in the parking lot with their cars running because it was freezing cold, and that was a violation. But yet, the liquor store was open. Have you noticed that? Liquor stores were open, the big shopping malls were open, and all the rest. Anyhow, it's just phenomenal. Bill C-9 is the latest one, and I'll just share what that one's about real quick. My time is running out, and I know your time is running out. But Bill C-9 is a combating hate act that is currently before the House of Commons. And by the way, I've written about all of these things I've talked about, and I encourage you to go to my website, firstfreedoms.ca. You'll never remember that, I'm sure. But firstfreedoms.ca, not unless I say it like about 5 times, firstfreedoms.ca, then you might remember. So you remember it's firstfreedoms.ca, right? So anyhow, so what happened is that in the Trudeau administration, he brought in the Online Harms Act, which was like an extraordinary reach of government. It was going to be hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, creating a whole new agency of the government. That's just what Canada needs, is another bureaucracy to be paying attention to everything that's going on online, to ensure that you are not violating or offending anybody, and all the rest. And so that created like a huge uproar, and it was part of the reasons why pressure was mounting on the Trudeau government, or at least Mr. Trudeau, to resign, and he did eventually. But then, of course, Mr. Carney has come in, and he's brought in not Bill C-63, the online one, but now it's the Bill C-9, which is the Combating Hate Act. And here's what they've done. They have watered down the definition of hate. The courts have dealt with hate for many, many years. We also have in Canada, like here in the United States, the criminal code, or the whatever it's called down here, but anyhow, it's the criminal law, is a state issue, and mostly. And then in Canada, it's the federal issue. So a criminal law is the same right across the country. And in the criminal code, then, we've had hate crimes as part of our criminal code for many, many, many decades. And it's, but now what's happening is this Combating Hate Act is going to take away one of the defenses on that criminal code provision, which says that if an argument or a debate is going on involving, and it's a religious matter, then it's known as the good faith. As long as it was done in good faith on a religious text or a religious dispute, it would not be considered hate under the criminal code. This act is going to take away that protection. So now religious debates will indeed be part of the concept of hate. And especially when you lower the definition of hate, the courts have said that hate is an extreme emotion that deals with the vilification and detestation of another. And this bill is basically saying it doesn't have to be a extreme emotion, but a strong emotion, and that it could be vilification or detestation. And so it's kind of like creating a higher or a larger net to take in the hate. And that is currently on the second reading. It's in committee. It will probably be passed, actually, at the Parliament, because, you know, Christmas is a long time for politicians, right? So they don't get into the office until sometime later on next week or the week after from their Christmas break. But anyhow, so that is one of the things. The other thing is that currently it requires the Attorney General to okay a charge of hate crime. That is going to be taken away. So now it's going to be up to the individual prosecutors. They will now decide whether or not to prosecute the hate crime on an individual. So there's all kinds of issues going on with respect to that. And I see that my time is gone. Even though I'm from Newfoundland, and Newfoundland is a half an hour later than the rest of the country, I will not take my Newfoundland privilege and say, we'll continue on for another half hour. But we will, I want to come back to this concept of what are we to be dealing with. And I haven't even got on to the whole issue of artificial intelligence, which is a game changer, that it's kind of like a tsunami that is heading our way, and how we're all going to face it. We're facing it in Canada as well. We got Canada's doing the digital ID. The current Prime Minister is also known to support the whole concept of digital currency. By the way, this Bill C-9 is going to be what I call the Police by Tweet Act, because when you now offend someone on Twitter, next thing you know, we're going to be like Britain, where there'll be a knock on the door at ungodly hours, which always seems to be the way, and you will be brought down to the station for questioning for what you've tweeted. That's where we're headed. Anyhow, so there's a lot of stress going on in Canada with a lot of things, and religion is just part of it. I haven't even dealt with such things as the public parks that are refusing religious communities to hold singing, like praise and worship programs and so forth like that. That's happening consistently. There's, in the province of Quebec, they have laïcité, which is the secularization of the province. There should be no religious symbols and those kinds of things. It's just and of course, they will all argue, well, you know, it's because of the child abuse thing that's occurred in the various churches. Church has no benefit whatsoever, and that's a huge concern. Groups like Cardis, which is a Christian think tank in Ottawa, is doing great work in showing that, listen, even by having a church on a corner of a community, produces, for every dollar that is spent, produces $3 in the local community for all kinds of reasons, and they got a whole study on it. It's called the Halo Project and the Halo Effect. Anyhow, as we're looking about all of this doom and gloom, we need to be thinking about, okay, so what do we do now? My First Freedoms project, the firstfreedoms.ca project, you remember that one, right? Firstfreedoms.ca. So that one is based on the decision of Justice Ivan Rand that I had just mentioned. But he points out, he says that the original freedoms are freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and inviolability of the person. And Dr. Allen was talking about the, what's the term in medicine about you got to have consent? Informed consent, but the whole idea behind that is? Autonomy. So in law, it's the inviolability of the person. The idea is that the state cannot do anything to this body, to this corpus, because without proper rule of law, i.e., in this case, consent, with vaccine, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the three areas that we are dealing with. And so I actually went up to Ottawa during the convoy, went through, talked to all kinds of truckers and people and finding out why they were there, et cetera, et cetera. And so I call this the 16 ways the truckers ignited Canada for the long haul. And there is like, when I read the decision yesterday of the Federal Court of Appeal, I mean, I was just praising the Lord, really, because in many ways, the very things that we have been arguing for the last several years, finally, we got a court, a high court, a Federal Court of Appeal. I wouldn't be surprised if the government appeals it to the Supreme Court. But anyhow, nevertheless, it just seems like common sense that people are allowed to protest, and you can't go sending in the military and the army and all the rest of it and create a situation like they did. The truckers parked where they did in Ottawa because the police told them where to park. Okay, so that's how rough these truckers were. They were literally cleaning up Ottawa streets because they were in such a mess, and all the rest of it. It was one of those true classic civil disobedience, not what you guys are experiencing here right now in Minnesota and all of that. No, these truckers were wanting to follow the law. They knew they would be fined. They'd be fined parking tickets is what they would be fined in the normal course of events. But instead, a sledgehammer comes, the Emergencies Act. Anyhow, all of that to say, that was to me an absolute violation of our charter rights. And the Court of Appeal at the federal court says indeed it was. Anyhow, very good. So what do? Well, one of the things is we got to be vigilant when it comes to upholding our inviolability of our personhood, ensuring that that government respects us as individuals, our AI and so on. That's going to be happening. There's combat. We need to combat haters of speech. There's a whole bunch of stuff I've written on that. Understand who we are as human beings. We are made in the image of God. We got to anchor ourselves in our faith. That is absolutely important. And brother, I love what you talked about courage, because I put in here the whole concept of cultivating courage, develop the resilience to withstand the challenges that are happening. And that doesn't, my wife and I, there's other things. One's about no fear, and I see my time is up. And I'm going to hand over everything. But let me just say this. My wife and I were hiking, I think it was either in the Jackson Hole area or up in Banff, Alberta. We were hiking, we're in our 30s, and we're hiking up the mountain. And this guy, who was definitely well into his 70s, passed us as if we were mere children. And we were like, how is that guy doing it? And we said to him, man, when we get your age, we want to be just like you. And he said to us, words that have come down throughout all of us, and we tell it to our kids, well, what are you doing now? And that's the question. What are you doing now? And so anyhow, by the way, I have copies of these books here. If you would like a copy, I'm happy to give it to you, but it comes with a cost. And that cost is that you go to firstfreedoms.ca, sign up for my newsletter, and you can have the book.